What is going on? Welcome back to another episode of It's a Blast podcast. My name is Mike, also known as the UD Hap Captain on X. Today, I'm talking to James LaPorta. He is a verification producer for CBS and former Marine Corps infantryman. We're talking about his time in Afghanistan, his time working in Hollywood, and his time as a journalist and producer. Let's get started. Welcome to the It's a Blast podcast. My name is Mike. Here, I talk to members of the veteran and military community about their leadership style and how the military has affected their lives. Let's get started. What is going on? I am sitting down with James LaPorta, a verification producer for CBS and also a former Marine. 8 years in the Marine Corps as an infantryman. Brother, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, of course. Look, I follow you on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it now. You've broken some huge stories. You've given me some advice in the past as well. And I want to talk about your time in the Marine Corps and kind of how that led to where you're at today and the success you've had. So let's start there, man. Why the Marine Corps?
Why the Marine Corps? That is the fault of a gunnery sergeant who I was in like JROTC in high school, and originally I was going to go in the Navy. I wanted to be a corpsman, but a gunnery sergeant got a hold of me. His name was James Watkins. He's a former drill instructor. That kind of I think he was a combat engineer, and kind of laid out kind of the history of the Marines, and that's kind of how. Was my segue into the Marine Corps. It was a high school instructor that kind of led into the Marine Corps. And so, it was a couple of years after 9/11. So this is like, I kind of knew around 2005. I didn't go in until 2006, but like 9/11 was still lingering. And I wanted to get out of Orlando, Florida,
That's fair. I respect that.
Yeah, I had, so that was pretty much, 10 days after I graduated high school, I was at boot camp so I went to Parris Island in South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, totally get it. My brother was a special forces medic, so I want to be an Army medic as well. And lo and behold, I failed that. It led to EOD, which in hindsight was the best thing that ever happened to me. So let's talk about
almost the complete opposite.
Yeah, I don't know how it happened. I try to tell the students here, especially those that sometimes they fail, they don't make it through, and there's a lot of emotion that goes into that. But try to tell them like, look, failure is not the worst thing that can happen in your career. As a matter of fact, a lot of times things happen for a reason. Yeah, let's talk about, I think you and I were in Afghanistan roughly the same time. I think you were there, 2009?
Yeah, I first went in 2009.
And so and I got there 2010. So I think we have a little bit of overlap there. But, I guess why the infantry, right? If you wanted to become a Navy corpsman, how did you wind up as a Marine infantryman?
Yeah, the complete opposite. Yeah, it was one of those things. It's a tale as old as war itself. Young men buying into the bravado of fighting. I totally bought into the Marines are first to fight, and the no better friend, no worst enemy. All the bravado that all the Marine Corps lore, which I later find out that some of that Marine Corps lore is not actually true. It's just like Marine Corps like folklore, So I totally bought into all that. And so I was like, well, that's what the infantry is, and then kind of learning more about how, the entire Marine Corps as an organizational force is structured around the infantry. One, because we're the smallest branch, but the entire, the whole point of the Marine Corps is to fight wars. It's their primary function. And so I bought into all that. So it was to the infantry. I will say boot camp, School of Infantry, and getting to the fleet, really a rude awakening. I was definitely naive, but I really thought it was going to be a lot like JROTC, which was fun. JROTC was a great time. Like we went on like camping trips, we did land navigation, and it was like fun land navigation. It wasn't like the miserable process of land navigation once you get into the military. But it was all fun, and so there's a part of me that it was definitely naive. Like I was like, oh, it's going to be just like JROTC, and it's not at all. Like it's not fun at all. Like when the infantry goes to the field, it's not like when JROTC cadets go out to the field, which I guess I should have known, but I don't know.
It's funny. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story. I don't know, but I went back to college as a staff sergeant, as an E6 in the Army, through the Green and Gold Scholarship. So effectively, the Army was paying me to go back to college and to come out and be an officer on the other side. And we did 2, field training exercises. You did one in the fall and one in the spring. Right. And so it's the fall field training exercise, and we go out there, and the battalion commander, for the RTC program, is like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna get a fire going. Everyone's gonna gather around. We're gonna have some food brought in. We're gonna tell stories. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, this isn't what the Army's like at all. And I went up to him and I was like, sir, what are we doing?
You had the burden of knowledge. It's what you had. You're like, oh,
what are we doing? He's like, Mike, we need him to join the Army. He's like, this FTX is fun. The spring FTX will be hard. And
he was playing the long game, is what he was.
Yeah, playing the long game, right? But
like you gotta throw that hook out there and kind of reel him in.
But what's funny is I would have cadets, ROTC cadets, come up to me like, is this what the Army's like? And I'd be like, no, there's a lot more sucking involved. And they'd be like, oh, thank God, this felt too easy, right? And I'd be like, okay.
Well, you're the old man. You're like,
yeah.
No, man, it's nothing like.
We'll get there. And then sure enough, the spring FTX rolls around in ROTC, and they're doing like 100% security and like not sleeping. And I'm like, here we go. This is what it's supposed to be.
You're the salty veteran that's like, I've seen things. Young guys.
And by the way, that was 6 years ago. The majority of them are still in, so they obviously seem to be liking it, I guess. Right. But I always think back to that fall FTX where it was like we're eating s'mores and just look at the battalion commander being like, what are we doing? And he's like, there's a plan here. It'll all become apparent, right? So how was that deployment 2009 for you as a Marine?
So I actually volunteered for it. What I mean by that is I was with 2nd Marine Regiment at the time, and 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, who I went with, they had come over to regiment and basically were asking for volunteers to go. The battalion itself was nowhere near at its max capacity. Like they were really hurting for Marines to go on this deployment, which is kind of how the Marine Corps kind of works. We're always kind of doing more with less. And so they had come over to 2nd Marine Regiment and had asked for volunteers. And I hadn't, I was an infantryman who hadn't experienced combat yet. And that in itself made me feel incomplete, which is kind of hard to explain to people. But as an infantryman, as a Marine, there is, you almost don't feel whole if you haven't gone through and experienced combat. You almost feel almost like it's an affront to your identity, in some ways. And so I was like, well, yeah, I'll go. Which is kind of the nice part of it was I got to skip all the pre-deployment, which was I got to skip going to 29 Palms, and being miserable. Like they were just like, all right, go over to SIF, grab your deployment gear, and we're going. So. I
don't think people realize that is, for me, I came in, I mentioned I came on that special forces contract, right? So I went through selection and failed that. And then I went to EOD school. And so from the time I had joined the Army to the time I got to a unit was 2 years. And so
wow.
I think it's hard. I think you hit it, right? I think it's hard for people to understand that when you join the military because the nation's at war, you want to go to war. It's, it's like playing a sport, right? If all you ever do is practice, but you never play in the game, what are you doing? So, I mean, I 100% get the sentiment because I was the same way. I felt incomplete. Like I was missing something. And then like you, Same thing. They called me when I was at EOD school. They said, "Hey, you still want to deploy?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Don't take any leave. Hurry up and get up here." And from the time I graduated EOD school to the time I was in Afghanistan was 3 weeks. Um,
Wow.
so like, I feel you. It was
Well,
great missing all the
in
pre-deployment training.
hindsight, though, I've talked to veterans who, uh, I feel a lot of empathy for them. The guys who were trying to get into combat, guys who wanted to deploy, trying to get into combat, and it just didn't happen for whatever reason.
Yeah,
And I feel really bad for them because they really, it's a special kind of guilt that they carry.
yeah,
That's hard for people to quite understand. But I feel very bad for them because they carry it as if like they blame themselves for not having gone through that. And me having gone through it and being on the other side, I'm like, yeah, I try to give them some words of encouragement of like, dude, you don't need to carry that guilt. Like, it's not fun.
yeah.
Because you go into it thinking, I need to fulfill this to complete my identity. But it turns out like, uh, who knew? War is not fun. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a great time. I mean, there's moments where there's great times, but it's a lot of boredom combined with moments of fear and excitement.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part to explain to people. It's like, war is a young man's game, right? It's a young
Right.
person's game. You go to war when you're, 18 to really 25. Those are the doers. Those are the people that are out there doing it. And anytime you watch a movie like Saving Private Ryan, which, great movie, right? But
Right.
you look at the actors that are portraying service members and they're like in their 30s and 40s, you're there for real. Like, you're there for real. Everyone's like 18 to 25. I mean, I was a 24-year-old staff sergeant running a team, right? Just
Right.
like in hindsight, a kid. But you lose your youth in war. I think that's hard for people to, maybe comprehend. And I think it's hard for people to comprehend the amount of boredom that goes into combat as well.
Right.
Like, you're almost waiting to do stuff, but then when you're doing stuff, like it's kinetic and it's a lot. Um, how was that? That 2009 deployment.
So 2009, it was yes. So President Obama's in office. The focus is shifting off of Iraq and shifting back to Afghanistan. Um, and so the in 2009 is aligned with President Obama's surge. So we're going to surge troops into southern Helmand province, and so I was a part of that. Um, the operation I was on was called Operation Kanjari, which is I think it's Pashto for strike of the sword or something like that. Um, at the time, the operation was billed as it was going to be this historic operation. It was going to be the largest helo insertion since the Vietnam War, and we were going to go the furthest south of any unit that had gone. So the British were already in southern Helmand, but we were going to basically like leapfrog over them. But it was definitely a wake up call. So my first day in combat was July 2nd, 2009. It was, RPGs getting shot at you, which the first time an RPG got shot at me, it's kind of in the same way people talk about 9/11, which is in the sense of like, when they talk about 9/11 and when they initially saw the planes going in, they say it looked like something out of a movie. That's exactly how it felt with an RPG flying over my head. It didn't feel real. It felt like something out of a movie, and it wasn't. It was, and that, but that moment sticks out in my mind because it was like I'm in it kind of thing. It's like you're here. Like I was getting shot at, but I couldn't see, the bullets whizzing past. I could hear the bullets whizzing past and snapping and stuff like that, but I couldn't see them. But there was something about the RPG that made it more real because you could see the smoke trail. You could track it as it so it was shot at me and my team leader. We went down. It flew over our heads, and I looked behind us, and there were Marines kind of moving out of its like trajectory, and it hit the dirt and exploded. But it looked like something out of a movie, So that was like day one, and then over the course of the next couple months, we lost 14 as a battalion. And the hardest part of that deployment was not the deployment itself. There was a moment on the deployment we were sort of we were about to rotate out, and we're about to be replaced with the next unit coming in. And our platoon sergeant gathered us around, and he said, "You're about to go through the hardest part, and that's going home." Which, at the time we were all like, "What are you talking about?" What do you mean the hardest part? We just went through the hardest part. We just went through months of losing our friends, walking through IED fields, dodging RPGs, getting shot at. What are you talking about the hardest part? The going home is going to be the easiest part. And, our platoon sergeant, he was a guy who had been through Fallujah. He'd been through fighting in Ramadi, and he knew better. He had, like I said, he had the wisdom that we didn't have. And he was right. The hardest part was coming home, because the hardest part was simulating back into the surrealness of 2 weeks ago I was getting shot at, and now I'm sitting in an Applebee's in Jacksonville, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And nobody seems concerned. Nobody, that's surrealism.
No. I'm pretty sure I set a record for how fast I got out of Afghanistan. And during 10/11, we were authorized 2 weeks of leave, right? And so I was on a super small combat outpost, in Paktika in RC East, out in the east part of Afghanistan. And we couldn't get anything, you know what I mean? We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was my time to go on leave. And we were forecasting that it was going to take a week to get back to Atlanta. And somehow I made it to Atlanta in 42 hours. I literally got on a helicopter, flew from the COP to Sharana, landed. They're like, "Hey, next helicopter's leaving." Got to Bagram, got to the terminal. They're like, "Hey, flight leaves in an hour." Got to Kuwait, got to Atlanta. And but the problem is, we had to travel in uniform. I'm wearing a dirty uniform. I'm covered in dirt. I still have I probably have explosive residue all over me, right? I got dirt under my nails, and I had not seen the color green in months, And by the way, all these route clearance patrols that we would support move at approximately 3 miles an hour, right? So I get picked up at the airport, and I'm white knuckling. My mom picked me up, right? My brain can't comprehend the color green. I'm in upstate New York, so all the trees are green. And I think we're probably doing 45 miles an hour, right? And I felt like I was re-entering the earth from a space shuttle. I was just sitting there white knuckled. And then you hit on it, right? It's you go back out, and your buddies are still fighting. There's still a war going on. You still got a team out there that's engaged in combat operations. And you go to Applebee's or you go to Chili's, and people are just living their
having
life,
a great
right?
time. Yeah, they're
Afghanistan's not real. It's not a thing. Nobody cares.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That for some reason it was surprising that life had not stopped.
Yeah,
back home.
Yeah,
it was, and as it shouldn't, right? Logically it shouldn't have, but for some reason the emotional side of Afghanistan, it feels like life, because in some ways life had become more complex, but in some ways life had become more simplified. In Afghanistan, it's very simple. Don't die.
Yeah,
just don't
literally.
die.
You don't have to think about what you eat. The food in the dining facility is there. You're either sleeping in your cot or you're sleeping on the side of a mountain. Don't got to worry about that. Someone will tell me that too. Right. Yeah, just don't die.
Don't die. Just get from A to B without dying. And very simple, but and I think that's where it becomes very hard to come back from that, because it is, and this, as strange and as scary as war can be, there is a peace within the simplicity of it, of don't die. As crazy as that says to sound, but the moment you get back from all that, life becomes very complicated. Like even simple things become very complicated. Of how do I get these bills paid,
Yeah.
or how do I, the insurance on my car is elapsed. Who do I call to, and that seems very more complex than just don't die.
Yeah.
And
I mean, look,
it's almost like everything's been reversed.
yeah, I mean, I make a lot of jokes on X about the Hurt Locker, right? I jokingly
Right.
say it's the best movie ever created. I'm not a big fan of the movie. There's a lot of inconsistencies, but there is one thing that movie absolutely nails and knocks out of the park. It's the scene at the end of the movie where he's standing in the cereal aisle
Right. I
and
remember
he's like looking left and right, like at all the different choices he has, and it's overwhelming, and
that. Right.
it's I think it's why people deployment hunt. It's like, I got to get back over there because the simplicity aspect, um there is something simple about deploying and being in combat. It's like, you're there, you're at work 24/7, you don't need to worry about what you're doing next. Someone's going to tell you, you're going to receive a mission order, and you're going to go do it. And it's simple, right? It's stay alive.
Right.
So, you deployed 2009. You went back in 13, right?
Correct.
How was that deployment for you?
Boring. I mean, 2009 was
13,
incredibly.
we're drawing down. Yeah.
Yeah. So 2009 was, I mean, it was very kinetic. I mean, not unusual to get in 3 different firefights a day,
Yeah.
or to go on a 10-hour patrol, or to
Yeah.
get into a 2-hour, 3-hour long firefights. Like 2009 was just crazy. 2013, as you said, we're the goal is to end major combat operations by 2014, and that to eventually set us up for a Afghan withdrawal. That didn't happen. But so in 2013, we're very much, the military itself in Afghanistan is in retrograde. There's a lot of demilling of established combat outposts and forward operating bases. It was a sad day when the green bean went away at Fob Dwyer. I was back in Helmand, but it was just very different. I was still infantry, but I was working in intelligence, so I was an intelligence cell chief for my infantry company. And in some ways, I will say working in intelligence was harder than being an infantryman. And the reason I say that is because as an infantryman, I had a very small, narrow window of Afghanistan. It's almost like looking at Afghanistan through a pinhole.
Right.
In intelligence, though, it's the Wizard of Oz. Someone has drawn back the curtain, and you can really look at all of Afghanistan's problems.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that was working in intelligence was very eye-opening, in terms of like, oh, this isn't as going as well as what's being said.
Right.
We're not turning a corner. We're not making progress. And that was actually harder to deal with, especially when coming from the infantry side. It's like, I'll give you an example. So 2009, we take over this area called Minapashte. By 2013, we had already given Minapashte back to the Afghans. And by 2013, it had already reverted back to conditions that were worse than prior to when we went in. So then you have to deal with, what did my friends die for?
Right.
Those kind of questions. And so 2013 in some ways was trauma, but it was trauma in a different way. It was the trauma of knowledge. Whereas the trauma in 2009 came from actions, but having to deal with that in 2013 was rough. That, and I unfortunately had to watch a 5-year-old, step on an IED, which was a traumatic event, which was insidious in itself because I've since written about this for the Associated Press, but there was this 5-year-old who he ran across. So it's a video captured by a GBOSS, which is ground surveillance, and so he runs across. He runs in front and he runs into frame and runs out of frame. and he realizes that he had stepped on something when he ran across the first time and didn't know what it was. So he comes back and he notices that there's something in the ground, doesn't know what it is, and he starts to jump on it almost like it's a trampoline, and it turns into kind of like a fun game for him. But he keeps jumping on it, but the IED is not going off. And I eventually realized the reason it's not going off is he's too malnourished, which is insidious in its own way, because it's like, oh, he doesn't weigh enough to, he doesn't weigh what he's supposed to weigh as a 5-year-old, because if he did, he would have been able to set it off. But he doesn't weigh enough, so now the bomb that is there to kill him, he doesn't weigh enough to set it off. And for some reason, that really bothered me, that in a twisted way of like, that not only is this kid probably about to die, he's dying hungry, he's dying malnourished. But eventually he throws his whole body weight onto it and disappears and dies. And so that was the other kind of traumatic thing of like seeing the war in Afghanistan up close. In 2009, I'm fighting the Taliban, but everything's from a distance.
Right.
There was a little bit of a standoff. Like when we first started engaging the Taliban, we'd get into firefights, 200 meters off, 100 meters off. And as the months went on, the Taliban would get closer. And so the closest engagement I ever had with the Taliban was like about 35 meters in one firefight. But it was always from a distance, but here it is up close, up personal. And I know all the woes of the entire country, not only militarily, but economically. And the poverty levels and Afghanistan basically turned into a kleptocracy. So the levels of corruption, and then add on to it the child abuse that's happening, the sexual child abuse that's happening, that's rampant throughout the country. It's just those are issues that I didn't have to deal with as an infantryman.
Yeah, I think that's the reason. Exactly what you're talking about when we talk about the eventual pullout, when we talk about Abbey Gate, when we talk about loss of life, and just the vet. I was on leave when the final pullout of Afghanistan happened, and I was just sitting there watching the TV. So everything you're talking about, in 2013 when you're working, as an intel chief, I think that's the moment every single veteran had, or every single service member had, watching Afghanistan end. Right? It's like, what just happened? What did I do? Did it make a difference? And exactly what you said before is what did my friends die for? And that takes a lot of reconciliation. I think a lot of people may never get there, right? And I think it's very job dependent. I think it's very like for me as an EOD tech, and this sounds selfish, but I think it was almost easier for me to deal with the end of the war because I was pulling IEDs out of the ground. And so for me, it was very easy to look back and rationalize and say, every single IED that I pulled out of the ground was one less IED that was going to kill either a service member or, like you're talking about, like a kid. And so that made it a little bit easier to rationalize, but still at a, at a macro level, right? When you zoom it out, this is going to be something that our generation of service members gets to deal with for forever, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of comparisons to Vietnam in that regard. Is like, okay, what was accomplished, and did my buddies die for nothing?
I feel a real kinship with Vietnam veterans. I actually wrote an article where I basically say that perhaps the best person to help Afghanistan veterans navigate the withdrawal of Afghanistan is a Vietnam veteran who watched Saigon fall in 1975. And it was interesting as the Afghan withdrawal was happening, I started looking back at old reporting from like Newsweek and the New York Times during the Vietnam War. Like how did they how did veterans feel when Saigon fell? And there's this article from Newsweek. They interviewed this veteran named he was actually still an active. He was an Army recruiter in Miami named Hank Marsh, and he talked about how he was watching Wei fall and how he felt about that. And he's watching Wei fall during Vietnam in his grandmother's house. And his grandmother turns to him and asks, "Do you think we should send the boys back in?" And Hank says, "No." And she's like, "Well, then what was it all for? Why were you there? What were you fighting for?" And the paragraph ends, and Hank Marsh didn't know what to say. And I felt such a kinship with Hank because that's kind of how I felt. It's like, I don't know what to say about it all. Like when someone asks me about Afghanistan, it's like, I don't know where to start with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember. I mean, I was home on leave, right? So, I was with family, friends, and everyone wants to have like this conversation about something that like I hadn't even processed. It's still in the process,
Right.
and
Yeah.
everyone wants to like over family dinner, like, hey, what do you think about Afghanistan? It's like such a hard question. I
Yeah.
don't think I have an answer now. Years
Right.
after, I don't have a good answer.
And there's Vietnam
Um,
veterans who are still processing.
yeah,
So for us to have answers to these questions even 3 years out is premature. I think.
right.
Like it's going to take a lifetime
Yeah,
to,
no,
you know.
yeah, I think it is. It is going to take a lifetime. It's going to be, I look back on it. I built some amazing friendships. I still talk to a lot of those, guys and gals from those deployments. I don't know, from a personal level, it's been something that I've had to deal with for the last couple of years. And I think the big thing is to realize that it's not isolated just me. It's having these conversations, right, and talking to
Right.
other
Yeah.
veterans and realizing like, okay, this is normal. This is commonplace. A lot of us feel this way. Um, you exited the Marine Corps in 2014. You were part of the great purging of
That's
everything,
right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I fell into a bad fiscal year. Basically, or at least that's what I was told by the career planner. So basically, I was trying to do 20. I had no
Yeah.
plans to become a journalist. Being, at that point, being a Marine was it. And I figured, well, I'm going to be doing this until they kick me out. I just didn't realize it was going to come so soon. So yeah, I was trying to stay in for my third reenlistment, but at that time, anytime the military tries to end a war, they become over budgeted in terms of the personnel that they have in the military, and you just don't need that many personnel when you're not fighting a war.
Right.
So, I thought this was just a Marine Corps thing. I have since learned that it was kind of service wide, that a lot of people were just getting kicked out going in from 2013 to 2014. No fault of their own. It was just kind of like, thanks for your service, but we don't have any more space. And
Yeah.
so, I was kind of dropped off into the world and not knowing exactly what I was going to do anymore. I went back to college, but even going back to college was, going back. I was going to college for the first time. I had done college courses like online, which but I was going to college, but it was just kind of like I guess I'll just do this because
Yeah.
at least my mortgage payment will still be paid.
Through that GI
but I
bill,
was still kind of like, I don't know I just lost my purpose. So I have no idea what I'm going to do. At least the GI Bill is going to pay my mortgage and I can drive an Uber on the side, which is what I did. I was an Uber driver. But not really knowing what I was going to do.
What was that
And
experience like you're a combat veteran going back to college with, kids, right? A bunch of 18 to 20, 23 year
yeah,
olds, that demographic. What was that like for you?
I had way more anxiety doing that than I had in combat because it's the moment in my life where I felt that whole kind of stereotype of like veterans not fitting in
Yeah.
and no one really kind of like understanding, uh, like really feeling like an outsider, so I'm 28, all my classmates are 19, who are, they were in high school like 2 weeks prior, they're going off to college parties. Meanwhile, I'm driving an hour and a half home because I went to the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. but I still lived in Jacksonville, North Carolina, where Camp Lejeune is, which is an hour and a half away. So they get out of class, they go and do their thing. I'm driving an hour and a half home to my then wife, and I'm like doing lawn work,
Yeah.
taking care of a house, and I'm being a husband, so it's like, so college was just, it wasn't, but one, I didn't feel like I was learning anything. And two, I felt like my life had like stalled. Like I wasn't going backwards, but I wasn't going forward either. Or at least in the Marine Corps, I felt like I was progressing forward. Well, now I'm dropped off in the world and my life has stopped. Just 6 months prior, 7 months prior, I'm working in a classified skiff, and now I'm driving an Uber on a Saturday night and dropping kids off to go to their college parties. So it was like, what am I doing? Like, and no offense to Uber drivers, but because I really I love being an Uber driver, but that contrast between working in a classified skiff to now I'm driving an Uber is just insane.
How do you go from being an Uber driver college kid to working in journalism? How does that even happen?
It was born out of selfishness. And what I say that, so I didn't grow up wanting to be a news person or working in news or working in journalism. I did writing as a hobby, but like writing, one, the writing wasn't good. And two, it was only writing for me. Like I was just writing, for me. It was never going to see the light of day, or I was never going to publish it anywhere. It was just kind of me getting like thoughts out. It was just like a hobby. And so, after Afghanistan, I knew that I wanted to write about it, but I wasn't in the right headspace to write about it, psychologically. Like I was still going through therapy, and I was still trying to work out my emotions through therapy. And I just wasn't ready to write about it. So I was like, well, maybe I could write about like others. Like I can like write about other veterans who have been, and they can share with me what they've been through. And I figured I could do that the best way through journalism, through news. But I figured that in writing about other veterans, that in some way that would be therapeutic for me. So it was actually selfish reasons.
Was it therapeutic for you?
No, it was not. No, it wasn't. It backfired. I ended up taking on a lot of the trauma that they were telling me. Yeah, because I started with, I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll cover veteran suicide, because at that point I had experienced, a couple of my friends had taken their own life, and I figured this was an area that is not being well covered.
Yeah.
Not fully knowing that I probably shouldn't have been covering that kind of stuff. Like it was probably going to do more damage to me at that point, I started in local news. So I used to work for the Jacksonville Daily News, which is the local newspaper outside Camp Lejeune. One of my stories there was about a friend of mine who had killed himself. My first story for the Washington Post was about another friend of mine who had killed himself. So I wasn't getting the therapy that I thought. However, even though I wasn't getting what I wanted, I did find purpose. I did find something that I had lost, which was, I had purpose in the Marine Corps. I was serving this thing that was greater than myself. I saw that journalism could be that too. That journalism could be an extension of my military service. Like I'm still serving the American public, but just in a different way. Just in a different way. And so that's kind of how I got into journalism. But it took a long time to get to where I was. I mean, I spent 5 years as a freelancer, sending out a lot of cold emails to people who did not know me. But I had a lot of good mentors too. Like I had a really good college professor. His name is Rory Laverty. He's he has been a good mentor of mine, and we've written stories together. But I also looked at veterans who had turned to journalism. One of those was Chris Shivers. His byline is CJ Shivers. So he's over at the New York Times. But the reason he became a mentor is because Chris Shivers was a former Marine captain, an infantry captain at that. He had served in the Gulf War, and I think he deployed to like the LA riots. you know, so those were kind of the early mentors that I had. That there were veterans in journalism, and not only were they in journalism, they were successful. So,
Do you think there's enough? You think there's enough veterans in the space in journalism?
no, it's very incredibly small.
And
There's not like, I mean, most veterans who are in journalism, I know them all. I mean, that's how kind of a small community it is.
what do you think that does to stories when they cover the military or veterans issues or things like that? Do you think that you know obviously being a veteran provides a different lens to the way you view life and obviously to the way that people write and produce stories, with a lack of veterans in the community, does that affect the stories that get told?
I think so. I think there are certain stories that only veterans know that traditional news doesn't might miss or not think about. Um, Veterans in the newsroom get highly relied on. So in my job, I field questions all the time where people just have simple answers of like, is it special operations or is it special forces?
Right.
Or is it a clip or is it a magazine? Like
That's
even
fair.
details like that. But then bigger questions of like a lot of veterans, um, and because of our knowledge base around firearms and stuff like that, I've found that veterans are incredibly invaluable when it comes to covering mass shootings and school shootings.
Yeah,
They
that
usually
makes
get roped
sense.
into that, which has nothing to do with the military. But
Right.
there's a knowledge base there that they can provide. Um, the military is it's simply the military is a microcosm of larger society. The same problems that exist in larger society exist in the military. We have
Yeah.
service members who are on food stamps. We have service members who are living below the poverty line. There's LGBTQ issues. There's sexual assault issues. There's natural disaster issues. So
Right.
covering the military. I've always looked at covering the military just like covering a small city. You're going to find the
Yeah.
same issues, and so I think a lot of people think of military reporting as very narrowly defined, but it's actually it's the exact same thing when you're looking at the micro the macro in terms of covering larger society. It's all the same problems in the military.
No,
Um,
that
so
that makes sense.
and that's kind of how I sold myself when I started getting into the more kind of professional journalism. Was like, look, even though I've kind of just been covering the military, I've also covered hurricanes, and I've also covered poverty, and I've covered homelessness, and I've covered, what I'm saying? Like even it's not just narrowly defined to military service. I've covered all these larger issues that also affect larger society. Which is
Yeah,
a good
just through the
selling
lens of the
point.
military.
Correct.
You
Yeah.
also you also worked as a military advisor to some pretty big TV shows. NBC This Is Us, Chicago PD, FBI. How? I mean, I guess that's the question. Like, how do you go from being a, a Marine infantryman in combat to a reporter, doing journalism to now military advisor to some pretty big TV shows? How does that happen?
It's an accident, or at least like when people have asked me, it's an accident. Like there was no like roadmap. It literally it's been a happy accident, particularly when it comes to working on This Is Us. Um, so like I said, I was a freelance journalist for 5 years, which is being a freelancer is scary. So it's like you're constantly like, am I going to be able to pay my bills this month? That's the
Right.
life of a freelancer, like, and not having healthcare. There's a lot of years where I just didn't, I couldn't afford healthcare. So, so my kind of the first professional job that I got nationally was I was working at Newsweek magazine. So I got hired by them in 2018. And This Is Us. So let me back up. So in 2015, my dad died 2 hours after my son was born. Same day.
Wow.
And because I was a newly minted father, I didn't have time to grieve my dad. And so I can, like, my war experiences, I just compartmentalized it. And I was like, well, I'll deal with this later. Skip to 2016, This Is Us premieres, and spoiler alert, there's a part of the show where it's about these kids who they lose a father. And so I kind of started watching the show like at therapy, as kind of a slow way of going to therapy. When you get into season 2 and season 3 of the show, you learn that the dad that has died is a Vietnam veteran. And so there's a whole Vietnam storyline in season 3. And so I'm watching the show just as a fan, but I'm watching the Vietnam stuff and I'm like, they're almost too accurate. Like, they're getting too much right, and usually, veterans, we're pretty good about picking out the mistakes when Hollywood takes out on our stories, and they weren't. Like, I was like, why? Like, when it comes to Vietnam, they're getting a lot of stuff right, like little things of when the draft was and how the lottery process worked in Vietnam, and little things like that, and so I was like, I wonder if there's a story there. I mean, typically I was covering national security and stuff like that, but I was like, oh, this might be a fun story. Maybe there's actually a good backstory of how they're accurate. And what I thought I was going to find was that there was some Vietnam veteran who worked on the show, or that they consulted with. Yeah. Well, it turns out they had hired Tim OBrien, who wrote the book The Things They Carry, which is, probably one of the best, books to come out of the Vietnam War. Tim OBrien was not a TV writer. He was a book author. So this was his first time writing for TV. And I was like, oh, well, that's the story. That Tim OBrien is probably, I think his book was nominated for the Pulitzer, and he won the National Book Award. Maybe I got that wrong, but just a phenomenal writer. And so I was like, well, that's what I'll do. I'm going to interview Tim OBrien about writing kind of the Vietnam storyline for This Is Us. And so after I figured out how to contact Hollywood, because I had no, which actually was a lot harder than I thought. Because, again, I was coming from covering the Pentagon and things like that.
Right.
I had no idea, who do I reach out to, So that took some doing. But, so they had set up an interview with Tim OBrien and Dan Fogelman. And Dan Fogelman was the creator of This Is Us. He also wrote the movie Crazy Stupid Love. I think he wrote Cars, the Pixar movie Cars.
Dude, I've seen it 87 times, dude. I got a 4-year-old.
Yeah. So I was going to interview Dan Fogelman and Tim OBrien. And probably an hour before the interview, I was scrolling through Instagram, and I saw an Instagram post where a Marine that I had served with in Afghanistan, his name was Gunnery Sergeant Vaughn Canalis. He was a human intelligence guy. He had killed himself at 17, 18 years in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that he had killed himself. I was looking at pictures from his funeral. I think it was pictures from his funeral, or it might have been his post. And so now I'm going into this interview where the interview is about serving in war and coming home from war and simulating back into life. And I got on the call, and I had a breakdown. I cried throughout the interview. And so, which I was incredibly embarrassed about, because I'm sure Tim OBrien and Dan Fogelman were like, who the hell is this guy? Right, but I just broke down over the phone. I couldn't get a question out. I'm kind of getting like I'm getting right now. Like I'm getting emotional about it. So we get off the interview. I call NBC. I apologize profusely because I've professionally embarrassed myself. I reach out to Dan Fogelman. I'm apologizing profusely because I'm so embarrassed by like not keeping it together. And Dan was like, "Dude, you're being like way too hard on yourself. Like we're a TV show." He's like, "You just lost a friend of yours. Like relax, kind of, like it's fine, it's okay." And he's like, "If you're ever out in Hollywood, stop by, kind of thing." And I didn't know if he was being serious or not, but a couple months later, I was in California for the first time. I was covering a story for Newsweek. And I took a chance. I was like, "Hey, I'm in Hollywood." Or I'm not in Hollywood. I'm in California. And he's like, "Oh, cool. Come by this." I laugh at it because it's so surreal, but he's like, "Oh, just come by the studio," which I thought was just okay. What do I knock on the door? Like, what do you mean you come by the studio? Like I just thought that was as a text. I just thought that was ridiculous. Like they're not going to just let me on, like. But so I drive from Joshua Tree, which is right next to 29 Palms, over to West Hollywood, and This Is Us is filmed on the Paramount lot, which is, I think it's like one of the oldest movie studios in Hollywood. And so he takes me around and he shows me the sets and he shows me the editing bays and things like that. And then he was like, "Hey, would you mind talking to our writers for like 15 minutes about who you are?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And so what was supposed to be just a 15-minute kind of thing turned into 2 hours. And where I basically kind of like what I'm doing right now, laying out my story, and at that point I was an open book. So I wasn't holding back on, my war experiences and things like that. And they said that one of the things they said was they had no idea that when they created the character Nikki Pearson, and that's the Vietnam veteran that you see in This Is Us, that there was going to be such a response from the public about showing the experiences of a Vietnam veteran, that and that the audience actually wanted more of that. And so they asked me if I would help them create an Afghanistan storyline, an Afghan, and create a character who had gone through Afghanistan. And that's how I got into it. It was all an accident.
It's a wild story, man.
And
it really is, right?
I mean, it becomes even more surreal because so this is the first script that I worked on. It was finalized. The first draft was finalized on July 2nd, 2019, which is 10 years, it's 10 years to my first day in combat.
Yeah.
So I kept having these like very surreal like moments while working on This Is Us. So I'm in the Afghan scenes. So if you watch if you watch season 4 of This Is Us, I'm in those scenes. And so we're out in the California desert and we're back in Afghanistan. And it was very weird because it's 10 years to the day of when I was in combat in Afghanistan. So now 10 years later, we're filming scenes about Afghanistan. Basically, the character, we made her into a woman, but the character has my military backstory. So it was just very surreal filming scenes 10 years later of what I was doing in 2009.
Did that help? So you talked about, you got into journalism to tell the stories of other veterans to help you process your trauma. Here you are 10 years to the day,
right,
in California. Once a Marine, always a Marine. You're still a Marine, but you're not in the Marine Corps anymore, but you're playing, a service member in Afghanistan. Did that help you process trauma?
Yeah. No, it did. The writing of those scenes was so the character I created, her name's Cassidy Sharp, that I helped create, I should say. There are a lot of people who helped create this character. Her name's Cassidy Sharp. her last name comes from Lance Corporal Charles Sest Sharp. He was the first Marine that was killed for my company on July 2nd, 2009. So her name comes from, someone I served with and who's no longer here. Everything that happens to that character in her story arc, I can tie to a real life experience, or I can tie to a statistical study. Like, I was like, I want everything that happens to this character to be based in reality, because we see her in Afghanistan, but we see her go through a divorce. We see her go through signing up for the vet center through the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I wanted everything to be tied to realism, into the actual experience that veterans go through. But no, it was incredibly therapeutic. I wish veterans could get the opportunity that I had. It was very real. There's a moment on set. First of all, it's amazing how real Hollywood can make things. So imagine we're in the California desert. It's July, so it's incredibly hot. We're all wearing the real gear. Like, I'm back in my frog suit. I'm carrying an M4. I got a plate carrier on. They got MRAPs for us, so we have MRAPs on set, like real ones. I mean, even down to, I told the costume director, like, I want the Marines to be wearing G-Shock watches. They got us all G-Shock watches. So there's just a level of details that they went into. There's background. The background extras are all Afghans. There's farm animals on set, and it almost became overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, I forgot that I was in California, as weird as that sounds. And some of the background extras who were playing the Marines were also veterans themselves. And they recognized that I was becoming overwhelmed. And the background extras came up to me, and they all kind of gave me like a group hug to kind of bring me back to California. That's probably the closest I've ever come to like having like a flashback or whatever, because I literally it all felt very, very real. Yeah. But it was just an amazing experience. But it was all incredibly therapeutic. So when I talk about This Is Us, it's not just a TV show for me. It's really where I kind of put to rest my war experiences for the most part. Like I've come to terms with them. Like, I'm definitely not going to get the answers to my lingering questions, but at least I can live with it, and I'm not torturing myself over it.
Would you do it all over again? I mean, you served in the Marine Corps for 8 years. It provided you a springboard forward. It also provided you a lot of trauma, right? As it has to many veterans.
Yeah.
Would you do it all over again?
Yeah, I think I would. And maybe that's the complexity of trauma when it comes to veterans, where it's almost like the trauma makes up your identity, if that makes sense. Like,
It does.
Like, I've talked to veterans where they're half of them, they don't want to. They want to be able to let go of that trauma because it's causing them so much pain. But on the fear, though, is, if I let it go, do I also lose a part of my identity by letting it go?
Yeah.
Where I'm at now is, the scars are a part of like who makes me up. You as a leader, you talk about failure. We learn through failures. And you almost have to wear them as a badge of honor, because it kind of shows where you've come from. Yeah. In some ways, our trauma becomes the ribbons and medals that military service members wear. It shows where you've been and where you've come from, and not only where you've come from, but what you've overcame to get to where you are now. So I would still probably do it all over again. separate from war and things like that, the military, there is a lot of good that the military does. The stories that I love covering the most. As a journalist, I get asked sometimes, like, what do you like covering the most? And I always give the same answer, and it's hurricanes. So I've covered about 3 hurricanes at this point, and it's usually from the military's perspective. But the reason I like covering hurricanes is everything that divides us as a people. Race, sexual orientation, politics, it all goes away, at least for a moment. And you see communities coming together in the aftermath, or even during like a hurricane. And the military is actually a part of that. I've been embedded with Air Force PJs and National Guard units and things like that, and which are also part of their communities. And I really love covering the military from that perspective, because again, it's this moment in time where everything that's dividing us goes away, at least for a moment. So those are my favorite stories to cover, is hurricanes, because you see communities coming back together.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. Hey, man, thank you.
I didn't mean to turn this into a therapy session.
Oh no, dude, you did. I think. Look,
I always worry about, like, am I getting too dark? Am I getting
look? Like, a couple things, right? The first thing is, we owe these stories to people. I think, there's a really good repository of World War II interviews. There's a really good repository of Vietnam. But in a lot of cases, when it comes to the global war on terror, when it comes to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria veterans, we're not telling these stories, right? I mean, they're human stories. They're stories that people deserve to hear. It's one of the reasons I want to sit down and interview you, because not only are you a person out there telling those stories, right, to the American people, but you yourself have a story that should be told. I think when people look at the military and everything that we've done in the last 20 years, a full generation, right? If you think about retirement at the 20-year mark, we have some incredible stories, right? And people need to hear more than the Medal of Honor and Silver Star recipients. They need to hear those stories too. But those are the stories they're going to hear, right? Those are the stories, that you can Google those names and you can find those stories. What people also need to hear is these stories, right? They need to hear the stories of, what did you do after you served in the military? How did you overcome trauma? How are you still serving the American people daily, right? Because, we could talk about service as being a very military thing. That's not necessarily always the case. I mean, you're out there telling the American people stories, not just in the military, but all stories. That is service to the country in a lot of ways. So your service hasn't, ended, right? It continues on. I want to say, hey man, thank you, for taking the time to sit down. Thank you for telling your story, because I think we need to get these stories out there. Thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for everything you continue to do. I look forward to, continuing our friendship and our dialogue. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And also, by the way, the letter and challenge coins you sent to my kid, that was awesome.
No, hey, any time. Hey, look, I'm making the next generation of VOD techs, right? So, no, hey man, thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate your time.